perennial wheat.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexis, and I'm here to present the functional properties of perennial wheat. To start off, I'll give some background on what is perennial wheat. It is a hybrid between wheat and wheatgrass, and like any perennial plant, it has the ability to regrow and survive for many harvests. So with the ongoing land degradation caused by intensive agriculture, perennial wheat is a promising alternative that creates opportunities for environmental sustainability and reduces soil erosion risk. As you can see from the picture on the right, it is a comparison of the root system of a perennial wheat and an annual wheat, and the difference is that the perennial wheat has an extensive root system. Perennial wheat is also robust and has a higher chance of survival compared to annual wheat due to its better resistant genes against diseases and pathogens, as well as abiotic factors. Previous studies have suggested that perennial wheat could be a better alternative in dual-purpose cropping because it has longer growing seasons and has better tolerance towards defoliation. So for my project, I wanted to know more about the suitability of perennial wheat in terms of commercial use, so I decided to look at the functional properties of perennial wheat. These parameters on the slides are the ones that I looked at, but the top three are the most important ones because they affect the end-use quality of wheat the most. So we have protein content, which influences the viscoelasticity of dough. To explain briefly on what is viscoelasticity, it is basically how dough behaves like glue. It relates to the elasticity and the extensibility of the dough and the ability to stretch and deform under gas pressure during fermentation. It correlates to the total starch content, which influences the rheological properties as well. But most importantly, starch acts as a thickening agent, and it provides viscosity and the swelling of the dough. And we have grain weight, which affects the milling yield and is part of the parameters looked at in the Grain Trade Australia standards to grade grain quality. The last two would be grain length, width, and grain color. I will not discuss further into that because of time constraints, but they affect less on the end-use quality as well. So on to my research questions. I have two. The first one is to compare the functional properties of different perennial wheat varieties and commercial annual wheat. And the second is to investigate the effect of site and climatic conditions on these functional properties. As for my materials, I had grains sent to me from New South Wales, Australia. And these grains are harvested from 4 experiments from 4 different locations from 2 years. So we would have Kara A and Mandurama in 2018, Kara B and Orange in 2019. Based on the Google map, you can see that these 4 locations are located fairly close to each other in the west of Sydney. And to investigate on my second research question, I've taken note of the weather conditions of these 4 locations. My key observation was the rainfall rate in 2018 was higher than the rainfall rate in 2019. Droughts were experienced in 2019 as well, which caused a decrease in grain yield, thus limiting my sample size. There are 9 genotypes chosen, including 7 perennial lines, 1 annual wheat, which was wedge-tail, and 1 triticale, which was endeavour. These grains were replicated in 3 blocks to represent a randomized block design. So for my methods, I started off with the external morphology. I've measured the grain length and width using digital calipers, and then I measured the grain weight according to the 1,000 kernel weight, which I counted 100 grains using a seed counter and weighed that out and multiplied by 10. And for grain color, I used a colorimeter with cuvettes filled with grain. Before I start any analysis on chemical composition, I milled my whole grains into mill samples using a ball mill. And for protein content, I use elemental analysis. The nitrogen content results are then multiplied by 5.7 according to methods from previous studies to calculate the protein content. As for starch content, I used Megazyme kits, which provide reagents and specific methods to follow. And the starch content was measured with absorbance and calculated with a formula according to standard curve. So here are my results. This table shows a summary of the significance of variables on the functional grain properties. And the ones I've highlighted in the red boxes are the ones that I'll talk more further in graphs. But overall, under genotype, you can see that all of the parameters, in fact, showed significance. As for experiment, only grain color chroma L showed non-significance. And as for interaction, most of the parameters showed significance except for grain length and grain width measured from left to right. So here are the in-depth discussion of my results for protein content. As you can see from the bar chart showing the experiments, there is not much difference to be seen. However, based on genotype, you can see that the perennial lines were higher than the annual wheats. And as for total starch content, experiments from 2018 were significantly higher than experiments in 2019, but there was no obvious variation or trend observed based on genotype. And lastly, for grain weight, experiments in 2018 were significantly higher than experiments in 2019 as well, but based on genotype, perennial lines were significantly lower than the annual wheats. So onto my discussion. I'll start with protein content. It is significantly affected by environment, and this is due to the high temperatures and/or the availability of nitrogen in the soil affecting the synthesis of protein. Based on my results, annual wheat was significantly lower than the perennial lines, which is similar to what was reported in previous studies. And this could be explained as the negative correlation between protein content and grain weight, and it is also known as the dilution effect. So to explain a bit more about the dilution effect, it is basically referring to how protein concentration is not exactly impacted by environmental factors, but instead it is the grain yield when it's decreased by environment that the protein yield decreases as well. And I'll talk a bit about the importance and impact of protein content. Although protein content affects the rheological properties, but most importantly, in fact, that is the protein composition that mainly affects the viscoelasticity, the elasticity, and the extensibility of the dough, and the way that the dough will trap gases during fermentation. On a side note, high protein content in the grains would be a great alternative for livestock feed as a high protein ration. As for starch content, it is also significantly affected by environment, which is similar to previous studies. And this is caused by drought, along with heat stress, affecting starch granule size and starch accumulation. Based on my results, perennial lines was not significantly different to annual wheat, which does not agree with previous studies. Previous studies reports that perennial lines are actually significantly lower in starch content than, annual wheat, perennial lines are actually significantly lower in starch content than annual wheat. Sorry for that typo in the slide there. But based on my results, my hypothesis is that there is actually a greater impact of environmental effects than genetic effects. And a bit about the importance of starch content. Starch acts as a filling particle in the protein starch matrix in dough, and it also influences the rheological properties, but most importantly, as I mentioned before, starch is a thickening agent, and it works to provide viscosity and swelling. And lastly, we have grain weight. So grain weight is also significantly affected by environment, and this is relating to the uptake of water into the grain during the flowering period. Based on my results, annual wheat is significantly different than perennial wheat, which is similar to previous evaluations. And a bit about the importance of grain weight. Grain weight is usually used by industries to grade grain quality, and it relates to the flour yield. Increased grain weight could also reduce mechanical damage during processing and could affect the cost of transporting grain, because grain is usually transported in an amount of grain in a fixed volume. In summary, environmental factors greatly influence the functional parameters measured, but as you can see, there could be a greater impact than genetic effects. This is based on my results on starch content. And which I mentioned before, was experiments showing a significant difference. However, there is not much difference between genotype. And annual wheat was significantly different to perennial lines in grain length, width, weight, and protein content. But overall, perennial lines can be considered a suitable alternative to annual wheat based on its similar or relatively similar starch and protein content. However, further evaluation must be required to know more about the suitability in terms of protein composition, rheological properties, mineral concentration, as well as trials for commercial use. And before I end my presentation, I would like to thank the New South Wales DPI for financially funding me and all my supervisors for their guidance and support, Caroline Clay for all her guidance and laboratory work, Deepa for helping me finish up half of the starch analysis, Ross for any statistical help, and I forgot to mention on my slides, but Kate as well for helping me with my elemental analysis work, and all my friends and family for their encouragement and support as well. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Excellent, that's so great. So has anybody got any questions for Alexis?
For the results, or okay.
So Adele has asked her to go back to the protein slide. That's why the view is changing for those online. So Adele is asking Alexis where the market is for this kind of wheat, potentially.
In fact, this is actually looked at all markets. It could be commercial use in bread making or livestock feed. We didn't particularly focus on a particular industry, but there is another. For your information, there is a variety called Kernza in the United States, and it's actually produced as flour. Then you can buy it and you can use it for bread making. So that's the only thing that I know about, but currently it's still in the research phase in Australia. Yeah, to comment with that, actually my supervisor actually did notice there's a high protein content for my varieties in the perennial wheat. So I don't know what happened with this batch of grain, but there could be something, probably an error with that, but we did notice that it was higher than usual. Yeah. So that was one thing.
So Michelle asked Alexis when the perennial plants were sown, and would the properties of those perennial grains change in future seasons?
As for when it's sown, I actually did not ask information about that from my supervisors that provided me the grain, but what's the second part of the question?
So, obviously the perennial wheat is a perennial plant, and it will grow for a number of seasons.
Yep.
What's sort of predicted quality changes in future seasons? So say these were grown in year one, what would be the differences in future years?
Okay, based on literature that I've read, there is actually much better regrowth in more years to come, but yeah, that's the only evidence I have about the effect of growing trees, which is perennial wheat actually has, I would say some varieties have lower regrowth ability, but there are some that are exceptional at regrowing in a following year.
So Kathy is asking how long perennial wheat might be grown for, so how many seasons, and therefore is there potential for root diseases or those kind of things which may not occur in an annual wheat?
So there's not much done to see how long it regrows, not to my knowledge, but I'm pretty sure it's still in the research phase. But as to the question about diseases and so on, there is actually literature on saying that perennial wheat has its own disadvantage, although it has better resistant genes to diseases and pathogens due to its parental wheatgrass. But there is this consequence of it being diseases throughout the long run. So there's the main disadvantage in terms of annual, compared to annual wheat.
So what Ruben is asking is whether gluten is present in the same kind of concentrations in perennial wheats than it is in annual wheat.
Thank you for asking me that question, because I forgot to mention I was actually doing analysis on the protein composition, so I do not know that answer to that yet, but I'm halfway through because I was planning to do an LCMS on the protein composition of perennial wheat compared to any. So I cannot give you that answer, but I'm hoping after my completion with the LCMS, which I paused for my presentation and thesis, that I would know more about the perennial wheat.
Awesome. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, Alexis. So next up is Josh Bailey, and he's going to be talking about the